So my name's Adeyemi Adegbesan. I'm a multidisciplinary artist from Toronto, Canada. I work primarily in the field of Afrofuturism and Afro-surrealism. My process is pretty eclectic. Like I have a background as a commercial photographer, so a lot of stuff is photo-based. I also work with digital illustration, collage, assemblage, and I like to source a lot of my images from either photos that I've taken myself or comic books or historic photos, stuff like that. The importance of Afrofuturism to me is the reason that my work centers around it so heavily is that I just feel like it's important to have the opportunity to create new narratives and to focus on creating from imagination rather than having the need to tie everything to direct historical facts or things like that. Like a lot of my work is informed by historical events, but I don't want to be forced to be hyper literal about everything and explaining everything through that lens and from that perspective. I think there's a lot of value to that, but I also think there's a lot of artists that already do that. I think the interesting thing about genres like Afrofuturism and Afro-surrealism is that they offer an opportunity to sort of create with more of a blank slate. I know for myself it's been very freeing, and I think a lot of other artists that work in that field feel that way as well, because so much of Black art ends up being trauma-based for very obvious reasons. But yeah, it's also nice to be able to create in a space that's not, centered around that. I think pride and empowerment are words that I use a lot. My hope is to spark a little bit of curiosity. There's so much symbolism in the work. There's a lot of things embedded in these pieces that I think people from Black communities can look at and see a little piece of themselves. But there's also a lot of stuff that may not be familiar, and if that sparks a little bit of curiosity and an interest to pursue it or to find something new, that's great too. I'm really passionate about the idea of sort of remixing and repurposing materials. I mean, it all, like from my perspective, it all sort of boils down to sort of collage or assemblage practice and I think you see that in indigenous cultures from across the world. I think how it takes shapes in Afro-Caribbean diaspora is like you see it in a lot of mask making traditions, from carnival to a lot of the traditions in West and Central Africa, masquerade traditions. There is a lot of repurposed materials, sort of eclectic materials finding their way into a piece. And the other thing that I sort of dawned on me as I started creating this work was that remix culture is also like it's sort of like the foundation of hip hop as well. And then when I started to sort of draw the correlation between the indigenous practices to creating art, and then the connections to the foundations of hip hop, because a lot of early hip hop equipment was made in a very similar way. It's like people breaking down speakers or radio equipment or bringing and sort of like building it back up to create their own sound systems, hacking into electricity from a public light post or something like that to power it. It's the same sort of ideology. It's the same sort of approach. So all that to say, I feel like remix culture is like embedded, or it just goes hand in hand with sort of like Black creativity. And whether you're talking about masquerade culture or hip hop culture, all the way up to the present, I think it's like a very fundamental part of the creative process. I think that's why I'm so drawn to it as a medium. So whether I'm working digitally, it's still a collage, or if I'm working with Wheatpasting analog techniques, I'm still sort of collaging, pulling in different materials, sort of creating a final piece out of that. But also like the music itself, for sure, like the sampling, the idea of like finding an old record and chopping that tiny little piece out of it and turning it into something new, but it's still a way of like building on history and moving things forward. So some of the ideas that I'm playing with are exploring the space between specific cultural and ethnic identities, and then the overall umbrella of Blackness, I guess. Everybody has their own ethnicity and cultural background, and I think for a lot of Black people, in Canada, for instance, there's a heavy Caribbean population. There's a lot of people from East and West Africa. So there's a lot of really rich specific cultural traditions, but then there's also this other thing. It's sort of like a societal media generation, this idea of blackness as a monolith, and so many things get called black and labeled black as if it's just one thing, and it's kind of crazy in a sense because it's almost like a non-descriptor. Like you're not when you call something black, you're not necessarily explaining anything specific because there's so much diversity within blackness. So that's kind of one of the main themes that I explore with the work as well. Is just like all these pieces are black and white to represent that idea of blackness as a monolith, but at the same time, the eclecticness of the symbolism, all the everything that's collaged into these pieces represents like all of the diversity and all of these different elements that that are included under that umbrella. So.